In this lesson, we're going to discuss if environmental factors can be used to increase soccer physical performance. And among those environmental factors or stressor, we're going to discuss altitude or hypoxic training and heat, and eventually the combination of both. So before getting into more details, when it comes to looking at the effect of heat and hypoxia, the first way to approach their effect on the body is to look at the acute responses of the body, which involves an increase in the cardiovascular system, an increase in thermoregulatory responses, an increase in metabolic rate, an increase in perceptual response as well. Those responses lead to an increased internal versus external ratio. That means that for the same amount of work performed either in hypoxia or heat, the physiological response will be greater. This has some great interest for practitioners in the case of rehabilitation, for example, or it can be a good way to use those types of sessions as top-ups after training, where we can get a metabolic effect without loading too much the legs, for example, or for kind of a flush recovery session where as well we can keep the neuromuscular load pretty low while still having a cardiovascular or metabolic response. But again, here in this talk, we're going to discuss more the chronic adaptation to training in the heat or in hypoxia, which most of the time involve an improvement in cardiovascular function, an improvement in the thermoregulatory responses, especially with heat training, an improvement in metabolic function, and an improvement in the perception of exercises during training or competition in this environment. When we talk about long-term adaptation to either heat or hypoxia, it's important to make the difference between what we call acclimatization, which is a normal process where athletes acclimatate or get acclimatized when they spend some time in the environment of interest. So, for example, athletes spend some time in the mountains, some time in a hot environment. The other terminology is acclimation, where it's kind of a more artificial type of adaptation, where players will spend time in hypoxic dormitories, hypoxic rooms, or heat chambers, for example, and they will exercise. We will not go into details between the difference really much of acclimation versus acclimatization. We're going to use the overall response to these types of training. But what is of interest for us is that adaptation to heat or altitude through acclimation most of the time is a target for team willing to play competition in these specific locations, like a team having to play an important game at altitude or a team having to travel and play in a hot environment. This was specifically the topic or another course in the same module. For this lesson, we're going to talk more about the ergogenic effects of this training and how we can use specifically heat or altitude training or hypoxic training to boost fitness. And when it comes to the different types of camps or approach, again, as discussed in the other course, we generally talk about the competition camp and more often a pre-competition camp where we try to assess the response of the athletes. Pre-season camp is often just before the competition. In this matter, we're going to talk more about typically pre-season camp or pre-season interventions where we try to boost fitness or try to accelerate the adaptation of the player using one or the other stimulus. So now the question was more, how do people have came to the idea of using the environmental factors as a way to increase fitness? So I think we can just start by listing the main physical capacities that are determinant for football performance. Obviously, we can list speed, agility, coordination, mainly neuromuscular related factors, and then obviously we have a big other important type of variables that are of interest and important for the football players. Is everything related to the ability to repeat this exercise throughout the game, namely VO2 max, which helps to the metabolic recovery between the sprints, but also to cover more high-intensity running distance. Having a higher VO2 max kind of decreases the overall relative intensity of a game, which is also indirectly likely improving performance. There are some evidence as well showing that having a good buffer capacity could help to kind of cope with the acidosis during this kind of efforts. Obviously, having a good anaerobic capacity helps for short intensity, a little bit prolonged duration as well, and different energy metabolisms as well. So when we think about the known benefits of altitude training on these different physiological parameters that are determinants for football performance, it's now well shown that some forms of hypoxic or altitude training can improve VO2 max, can improve running economy, can improve anaerobic capacity. So it makes sense to kind of offer football players to use altitude to try to improve some of these factors, knowing that one of the most important factors via or through the one hypoxia improves performance at VO2 max is the production of more hemoglobin mass or red blood cells, which are involved in the ability to carry oxygen through the body. On the other side, we're talking about heat as well. Some of the adaptations to training in heat include, among many others, an improvement in cardiovascular stability or cardiac efficiency through an increase in plasma volume, which indirectly can also enhance VO2 max. There are also some evidence showing that heat training can help the body to better manage the utilization of the different metabolisms, and in turn can also be efficient in the context of football competition and training. So to go a bit further into the view of using environment as a training stimuli, if you look at the first line, in this case we just have skill work as the input, as a training input that will obligatory lead more or less to a stabilization of fitness. If the training is just based on skill, we may have a decrease in fitness. If there is a bit more intensity in those fitness in those soccer drill, the fitness might increase a little bit. But obviously, we won't be able to develop properly fitness. That's why what everyone does, we add to the skill work, we also add some conditioning session with additional drills, which allow to increase fitness. The problem, put it this way, with that is that we have to increase overall training load, which is sometimes not a problem, but during congested fixtures or for any other reasons, or even pre-season where the coaches have to spend a lot of time on the tactical aspects, it becomes difficult to add too much conditioning work just because of the overall increase in training load. So the main idea, and that's the third point, is to think about another way to add some training contents, but in a sense that are not really increasing the load per se. So the idea is that if we perform some of these skill sessions, if possible, if we perform some low intensity or less demanding sessions through the environment, which is, as we were discussing before, eliciting some enhanced metabolic cardiovascular responses, we may be able to gain fitness. Why not obligatory increasing the load into larger proportion? So I like to say it's kind of almost a free increase in stimuli to gain fitness without training as much as during normal conditioning, because we get the additional benefit of the environment per se. So I'd like to discuss first what's been shown and what are the options when it comes to train in hypoxia or altitude. So again, it's just important to make the difference to start with what we call natural hypoxia, which is kind of altitude, so where players stay in altitude, and obviously the decrease in oxygen availability to the body comes through a decrease in barometric pressure. So that's one specific mechanism. And there's another mechanism which is the artificial type of hypoxic stimuli, and it's more or less in a chamber, in a room, where through machines, we just withdraw, they kind of suck a portion of the oxygen. So in the end, the availability of oxygen is also less. At the end, we more or less have the same mechanisms, less oxygen, but the way the oxygen, the level of oxygen comes is a bit different. But again, there's been some research comparing both, but that's probably too far from for the course for the lesson today. But overall, we have a lot of acute physiological adjustments to the exposition to either natural or artificial hypoxia that actually trigger some adaptation that we're going to discuss now. So when it comes to discuss the different options to use altitude training, as you can see on this graph, there are many options. The most common altitude type of training is the one called live high, train high, where typically athletes, football players travel to the mountain, they live there and they train there. But it's been sometimes discussed that training in altitude could lead to a decrease in intensity or the quality because of the difficulty of exercising at high intensity in the air. So then people have started to suggest to live high, but go down for some session, travel and train low. So it could be a live high, train high and low, for example. Other options could be to sleep at your normal environment, but go for some specific key sessions in altitude or simulated altitude, which is the live low and train high, for example. So if we want to list some of them, you have, as I said, the live low, train low, that's nothing. Live high, train high, everything happens in the mountain. Live high, train low. Live low, train high. Live low and rest high. That's a bit different, is that you just perform, you don't even perform exercises, you just spend a few hours a day in a very high simulated altitude, which is supposed, because of the altitude, to trigger specific adaptation. It's like simulating a minimum 4,000 meters, for example. And on the top of that, you can just imagine changing from one to another one throughout the same block, or even throughout the session, throughout the week. As you can see, if we just look at kind of a recipe, it looks like we can do a lot of things, and there are probably some key adaptation related to each type of training. But it's easy to understand that it's not that easy to program that without a very deep knowledge in the altitude benefits, which is obviously not the case of everyone, which in my opinion makes it a bit difficult. So if we want to clarify and to make things a bit more simple, we could say that mostly the main adaptation that people are looking after when they train high, like most of the time it's high intensity, repeated sprint session in a hypoxic chamber, so train high, or if we train in altitude, we are mostly after peripheral types of adaptation. So more targeting the oxidative and the metabolic aspects in the muscle. Conversely, what people are looking after when they sleep high or spend some long exposure times in altitude, in this case, we're targeting more a central kind of aspect. We're targeting the production of hemoglobin mass, which is, as we discussed, involved in the ability of the body to carry and transport oxygen. So to simplify a bit, we can say training high promotes the muscle ability to utilize oxygen, while living high, spending a lot of time high, promotes the ability of the body to carry oxygen. Which, I guess now you start to understand, makes appealing the fact of using both techniques to say, okay, I'm gonna work more on my muscle, I'm gonna train high, I need to work on the circulatory system, I'm gonna live high. To be able to implement that, obviously, knowing the tight fixture, the logistics for teams and so on, it's pretty difficult to spend much time high as well. So there's been a recent trend in team sport to really push to implement more this type of high altitude training. And as you can see again on the slide, you see many different new materials that are available to train high. You can see these long tunnels, hypoxic tunnels where people can sprint, You have even kind of a mini dome where a player can actually could play a 4x4 in this big hypoxic tent. So that's been put on the market with the ability to allow players to even train with the ball while still remaining in hypoxia for maybe half an hour during training. And how this works, or why do we focus more on the peripheral aspect when we train high? As you can see on this graph, that's a study from that we did back in the days in Doha in Qatar, and you see a young runner, 800 meters runner, who has performed the same high intensity session both in altitude, simulated altitude, or at sea level. And as you see, because of the reduced oxygen in the room, his VO2 max was way lower. His VO2 during exercise was lower. All the typical variables elicited during an interval training session were lower, which in terms of heart rate, ventilation, obviously doesn't help to improve this aspect. But what was of interest for us is that he was showing a clear tissue desaturation. So less blood, less oxygen in the blood, less oxygen in the muscles, less oxygen in the head, for example. And this is probably the key. These are probably the key triggers for adaptation. Now, so if that's what we're interested in, what shall we implement? What kind of session shall we implement when we train high in this hypoxic chamber? I just pasted here an example of a recent review of literature, and you can see more than 25 studies having used more than 25 different protocols. So it's pretty difficult to really target one, but as you could see if you were given the whole detail, most of these sessions involve repeated high intensity exercise above the power associated with maximal oxygen take, or the speed associated with this speed, or even repeated sprints, maximal sprint. That's important to note, and that's probably when I become to see a bit of the limitation of these types of training, because as we discussed many times already, football per se is already pretty demanding in terms of neuromuscular demands. So again, if we're trying to sell the interest of using hypoxia or heat to gain fitness is to be able to gain fitness without doing too much more. But if now we have to add sprint training after a normal session, I don't really see the benefit of that, because we're going to increase neuromuscular load and potentially fatigue. So to me, that's a big limitation of using hypoxic training in this context, because of the neuromuscular load associated. Another limitation is that most of the time, to really trigger this muscular adaptation using repeated sprint in altitude, we need to perform about 10 to 12 to 14 sessions. And again, how do we fit 12 repeated sprint session into the calendar with a football team? Again, pretty difficult, knowing the constraint and so on. So, in my opinion, training high becomes very difficult to implement that into our current football setting for these reasons.